I grew up in the glow of her light. My sister, Livia, had always been the kind of person who turned every room into a stage and every moment into a triumph. From the very beginning, my parents' pride seemed exclusively hers. I, on the other hand, existed in the margins, an invisible shadow who quietly applauded her victories while hiding my own small defeats. At family dinners, they would recount her achievements as though she alone carried the family's worth. "Did you hear how Livia won the scholarship? She's going to be the one to make us proud," my father would say, clinking his wine glass in her honor. And there I sat, pushing my plate around, barely able to look at her without feeling a knot of resentment twist in my chest. I tried to celebrate her, really, but every congratulatory smile they forced me to wear felt like a chain tightening around my spirit. I remember the day clearly, the first time I realized I wasn't just ignored, but actively replaced. I had stayed up all night perfecting a project for school, something I poured my heart into. When I presented it, my mother glanced at it, sighed, and said, "That's nice, dear, but Livia's science fair project is far more impressive. You should learn from her." Her words hit me harder than any teacher's criticism ever could. I felt small, worthless, and entirely unseen. Over the years, the pattern never changed. I tried to reach for them, to ask for guidance or affection, but my family's attention was always reserved for Livia. My own successes were met with polite nods or, worse, comparison. "You did well, but not like Livia." The message was clear: no matter what I achieved, it would never be enough. The love I craved, the validation I thought a family would give unconditionally, had been withheld. By the time I reached high school, I had learned to retreat into myself. I became quiet, observant, a master of blending into the background. I cheered Livia on when she won awards, when she received praise, when she became the person everyone admired. And yet each cheer felt like salt in an open wound. It wasn't that I hated her. I loved her, but I hated the way my family treated me, like I didn't exist. The final straw came one evening, when my parents called me into the living room. I remember their faces, bright with excitement, as they announced yet another opportunity for Livia, a national competition that would surely secure her future. They smiled at her, gushed over her potential, and then glanced at me. "We just hope you'll continue supporting her," my mother said casually, as if my entire purpose in life had been to prop up my sister's brilliance. I left that night and didn't return for days. I walked alone through streets illuminated by the harsh city lights, wondering why blood that flowed through my veins could mean so little to those who were supposed to love me most. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet dismissal, the subtle preference, the whispered comparisons that echo long after the words have left the lips of the ones who hurt you. And in that silence, I swore something deep within me would change. One day, they would remember my name, but not as the shadow behind Livia. Not as the forgotten sibling. One day, they would know exactly what they had thrown away. I didn't just leave my home that night. I left the idea of them, of what they had made me feel, behind. For days, I wandered through the city, letting its cold streets swallow me whole. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, yet strangely, I felt a flicker of relief. For the first time in my life, I wasn't competing for attention or validation. I wasn't a shadow, I was just me. The loneliness was suffocating at first. I rented a small, dimly lit room in a part of town where no one knew my name. No one cared about my family's golden child. The quiet was foreign. I missed familiarity, even if it had been poisoned with neglect, and yet, slowly, I began to rebuild myself in that emptiness. I discovered talents I had buried to avoid comparison. I wrote, I sketched, I experimented with things I had long abandoned because Livia was better at it. With each small success, I felt a little more like a real person, someone capable of existence beyond being her foil. There were nights when I cried so hard, I thought my lungs would collapse. I imagined my parents laughing at Livia's victories, my sister holding their attention like a trophy, and I hated them not just for what they had done to me, but for how they had allowed me to believe I was nothing. That hate was raw, pure, and somehow invigorating. I realized it wasn't about revenge yet. It was about survival, about carving out a space in the world that no one could take from me. I took odd jobs to survive. I pushed through humiliation, exhaustion, and doubt. And as I did, I began to understand something important. The world outside my family didn't measure my worth against anyone else. Out here, my failures were mine alone, and so were my successes. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was enough. I could prove it to myself. Months turned into years. I learned to walk with my head held high, even when the shadows of the past crept up at night. I discovered mentors who valued my dedication, friends who celebrated my small victories, and opportunities I had never dreamed of, while chained to my family's narrow expectations. I was no longer invisible. I was unstoppable, quietly gathering strength and resources, growing into someone they would never recognize. And yet, in the quiet moments, the hurt lingered. I thought about the evenings at home, the way my parents had looked at Livia, the way I had been dismissed so casually. I realized that my anger, my pain, was a fire, and fire had the power to transform. It could consume, or it could forge steel. I chose the latter. I began to imagine a future where the balance would shift, where the hands that pushed me down would tremble at my rise. I didn't want petty vengeance. I wanted something sweeter, something undeniable, the quiet, inevitable proof that I had been wronged, and that I had thrived anyway. My sister might always be the golden child in their eyes, but in the world I was building, I would be the one shining brighter, the one they would come to rely on when their own failures became too heavy to bear. For now, though, I stayed in the shadows, patient, learning, and preparing. The family who abandoned me had no idea that the person they discarded had become someone they might one day have to respect or fear. The years passed, and the city that had once swallowed me whole became my proving ground. I was no longer the quiet shadow hiding behind my sister's brilliance. I had grown into someone formidable, someone the world couldn't ignore. Every obstacle, every moment of doubt, had strengthened me. I learned to turn my pain into strategy, my anger into focus. And slowly, meticulously, I built a life my family had never imagined I could. I started small, freelance projects, odd commissions, anything that allowed me to exercise my talents and prove to myself that I had value. Each success was a quiet rebellion against the years of dismissal, each paycheck a whisper to the universe that I was more than they had allowed me to be. I savored the irony that my sister, adored and nurtured by our family, had never needed to struggle, while I thrived in the crucible of adversity. Then came the bigger opportunities. Doors I never thought would open began to swing wide as people noticed my dedication, my skill, and my relentless work ethic. Clients who once overlooked me came back. Colleagues who had doubted me now sought my advice. I learned to command rooms with the calm assurance of someone who had survived being invisible. I became, in every way that mattered, indispensable, and I did it on my own terms. Yet I never let the world see the fire that burned quietly within me. I was patient, methodical. I didn't rush revenge. I orchestrated it like a symphony. I made strategic connections, cultivated influence, and ensured that when the time came, it wouldn't be an emotional outburst that surprised my family, but a quiet, undeniable reversal of fortune. Small ironies began to reveal themselves. A former colleague of my father, now running a company my parents once dismissed, invited me to speak at a conference. The words I shared resonated with an audience of leaders and dreamers alike, and I could feel the shift. A world that once ignored me now hung on my insight. I imagined my parents watching from afar, realizing that the child they had deemed worthless had become someone others looked up to with admiration. At night, I allowed myself the rare indulgence of remembering the pain, the birthdays when I was overlooked, the evenings I had spent clinging to hope, the casual cruelty of being constantly compared to my sister. I didn't let it weaken me, I let it sharpen me. Every success, every achievement, became a quiet tribute to the resilience that had grown from my suffering. And yet I kept my heart guarded. I knew my family's callousness ran deep. The same people who had ignored my tears might never truly apologize. But I no longer needed their validation. I had learned that empowerment wasn't just about money or influence. It was about knowing your worth and never allowing anyone to undermine it again. Now, as I prepared for the next stage, the point at which my family would have no choice but to notice me, I felt a mix of anticipation and calm satisfaction. I had become a force they could not dismiss, a reality they could not ignore. The world had recognized my brilliance, and soon they would too. Not as the shadow behind Livia, but as the one they had foolishly abandoned. It was a rainy Tuesday when the first call came. My phone lit up with an unfamiliar number, and when I answered, the voice on the other end carried a note of desperation I hadn't heard in years. "Please, we need your help," my mother said, her voice tight with urgency. "Livia, she's in trouble, and we don't know who else to turn to." For a moment I remained silent, letting the words sink in. The family that had ignored me, dismissed me, and made me feel invisible now reached out because their golden child had stumbled. It was a cruel twist, almost cinematic in its precision. They were calling me the only hope they had, an irony that was both delicious and profoundly satisfying. I remembered the years of quiet suffering, the nights I had cried alone, the times I had sacrificed myself emotionally for the success of someone else. I remembered the cruel comparisons, the dismissive glances, and the unspoken message that I was never enough. And now, here they were, bowing, not to my sister, but to me, the very person they had abandoned. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I let the silence stretch, feeling the power of it. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm, composed, a far cry from the trembling child they had ignored. "Tell me everything," I said. Over the next hour, I listened. I gathered facts, assessed the situation, and quietly formulated a plan. I could see the desperation in their voices, the subtle guilt that threaded through their words, though they dared not fully admit it. And I realized then that revenge wasn't about humiliation or cruelty. It was about control, about showing them, without malice, the consequences of abandoning someone they had deemed insignificant. By the evening, I had orchestrated a solution. My contacts, my influence, and my resources, carefully cultivated over years of perseverance, solved the crisis with precision. Livia's problem was rectified, and the family's relief was palpable. They praised me, begged my advice, and offered gratitude as though I were a deity descended to save them from ruin. I smiled inwardly. Their desperation had placed me at the center of their world for the first time, and I held that center with grace. I offered help, but I made it clear that boundaries had shifted. I was no longer the shadow behind my sister. I was the architect of outcomes, the force they could not ignore, and the reality they had once forsaken. When the call ended, I looked out the rain-streaked window, feeling a weight lift from my chest. The family who had abandoned me had finally seen the truth. I was powerful, independent, and indispensable. And the sweetest part of all was that I hadn't had to stoop to cruelty. I had risen above. My success was my revenge, my independence my triumph, and their recognition, a bitterly satisfying acknowledgement of what they had lost. I realized then that revenge is most potent not when it destroys, but when it demands recognition, respect, and inevitability. I had been overlooked for too long, but now I was undeniable. The child they had abandoned had grown into someone they could no longer ignore, and I had done it on my own terms. As the storm outside subsided, I allowed myself a quiet smile. I was no longer the shadow. I was the light they had failed to nurture, shining brighter than they could have imagined. And in that brilliance, I found my peace.